Hey there, welcome to Incorruptible Mass. Our mission is really to help you transform state politics. We know that together we can make Massachusetts policy reflect the needs of the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful state. And today we are talking about power. We will talk about what power is and what power is not. We are going to talk about, we'll give you a little spoiler alert that, for example, power is not about the adjacency to power. We'll talk a little bit about how people are recommended to do these power analyses that are actually not helping. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how power exists to be used. That if we want change, we have to have power. It is the only way that change will happen. So before we go on, I will introduce my magnificent co-hosts, beginning with Jonathan.
Jonathan Cohn, kind of he, him, his, joining from Boston. I've been doing work on different issue and electoral campaigns for close to 1 decade here in Massachusetts.
And Jordan.
Jordan Burke Powers, he, him. I have been working in progressive politics about the same amount of time, I guess.
Longer.
Longer, but you know. But what if I want to be younger, Jonathan? So it's
And I am Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. Bunch of national, local political stuff on the national stage, then some state level things. And here I am, super excited as always to talk about what's happening here in Massachusetts. And near and dear to my heart is thinking about and talking about power. And I want to first start with a basic premise that if you don't have power, you can't get what you want. Comments?
Yeah. I think I'll find the quote, but I always think of Dr. King's quote around this, right? Like, how this work without power is just sentimentality. Love with, what is it? Yeah, that's it. Love
without power.
Love without power is just sentimentality.
Yeah. I love that quote. We should look it up. It's power without love.
Power without love.
That's a good quote.
It's tyranny. So
tyranny. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. And so we want to talk a little bit about the positive side, right? And not just the negative side. We'll get into the things that we see people doing that are not working. But I think I want to just, because of my background, I want to throw out this story because it's really the story that got me to full-time dive into local politics, which is the story of this group in Richmond, California, that, they sort of the terrible problems in their city, very low wages, terrible police brutality problems, environmental, like Chevron plant there that was like, fires and explosions every 5 years, damaging the environment, like sending hundreds of people to the hospital. I mean, it was like a place with a ton of problems, second highest homicide rate in the country. And this organization came in, took over the city council against millions and millions of dollars spent against them, but they succeeded in gaining power and they transformed their city with policy. Right, passed a $15 minimum wage law. This is in the early 2010s, I think. To completely turned around the police force. They they basically changed their entire city through policy because they gained power. That power, the way I love to think about power is about carrots and sticks. That power is about having some real carrots and sticks that you have, that you can control, that will allow you to affect the people who are sitting in those places to make policy. So I'll stop right there before going any further into that example, but to see what thoughts you guys have about that.
The one thing I would just note in terms of just the use about carrots and sticks is it dovetails well with the fundamental principle that power needs to be used to exist, and how with that one example that those are different ways of leveraging or manifesting the power that one has. Because if you claim to have power and you don't use it, it's almost kind of like if a tree falls and no one hears it, didn't make a sound. type issue that it only exists in a kind of a fictive or a kind of potential state rather than something that's used, because it often feels like the case in the political realm that there are many people who view power as something to amass but not use, so that it's that things are not done because they would damage the power that somebody has, but unless that power is specifically used to advance ends, then nothing is even being accomplished toward that goal.
Oh, that is so interesting to me. And Jordan, I want you to jump in on here because I remember talking to legislators who believed that if they just got into a position of power, they would be able to make change. If they just kept working and doing what the speaker said for year after year after year, that they would then be the head of an important committee and they would be able to make change. And what they said is that when they were at that top of their career in this position of supposed power was when they had the least ability to do anything. Super fascinating.
See earlier episodes where we talk about the fact that if you tried to do anything you wanted, you would lose that committee and you would be kicked out. So yeah, I think to hear people talk about it, the purpose is to amass power. And I just want to highlight again what Jonathan said, that they rarely want to actually exercise power. And that's not just true. That's not just true sort of with the legislators. It's true with a lot of people who have access, people who have that linchpin that sit at those intersections. They rarely want to use those opportunities to leverage for the things that should make things moving forward and make people better. I can tell you in my own life that this is something that always troubled me. People, that I sat at an intersection of having access to things, and people would say, "Oh, like, will you give access?" Like, yeah, every time, because I actually think that that's a part of the work, is to continue to ask to give people who have, more power or more privilege or more opportunity, to ask them until they say no, right? To say until you've worn out that thing, right? So I think rather than always amassing power, we rarely think about how are we exercising it and using it, especially when we sit at access points to it. But I'm also thinking a lot about like what, when we think about carrots and sticks, like the most basic one we don't do in Massachusetts. And it's been the weirdest thing coming from not Massachusetts to Massachusetts, is how juvenile, how grade school our political sort of organizing class is, how little basic organizing happens and basic tactics happen. One of the most basic tactics is to get regular people to talk to their legislator, right? It's like organizing 101. And yet that rarely happens. It rarely happens. And if it does happen, it almost always happens centered around tiny pieces of big problems. So this tiny bill, this little sliver, this little piece, it's rarely to push them to do bigger things, to do broader things, to do bolder things. We just rarely are doing systematic bringing in people who aren't the regular people, right? We ask our organizers to show up to meetings instead of asking our organizers to get more people who aren't the normal people to show up to meetings. We ask our super volunteers to come to in-district meetings or to sit on a Zoom meetings. You know what that legislator sees? People I ignore every year.
The same exact people, right? The same people.
And when I've talked to legislators, we rarely ask those people to bring it, to call regular people and ask them to be engaged, ask them to be a part of it. We rarely ask our activists to amplify the messages that are coming out there, to talk to regular people and not just be in our own bubbles, right? Like we're rarely doing those things, those mass mobilizations. Sorry, Hannah.
Yeah. No, I've just heard from legislators that they say it's the same 100 people in their district of over 40,000, the same 100 who come to all the meetings, who do any kind of lobbying. It's always the same 100 people. And, should you listen to only 100 people out of 40,000 people? No. But to me, this also brings up this incredibly important concept from Jane McAlevey, the union organizer, of the difference between what she calls mobilizing and what she calls organizing, that mobilizing is taking the people who already follow you and just getting them to show up. And organizing is getting all those people who don't follow you to show up. And I want to tie this into
That's
something
an interesting. Let me push back on that and say
Please.
that actually, Hari Hand, which is one of my favorite writers, talks about this on a spectrum, which is really just a really fancy way to say that everybody's saying the same thing and using different words to say the same thing. But the way that she describes it is mobilizing is getting a mass of people to things, and organizing is sort of it's those deeper one-on-ones, those people who are activists. And that you need organizing and mobilizing to be successful. You need people to just show up. And one of the mistakes that a lot of new organizers do is they try to get everybody who wants to be mobilized to be organizers. And that's a mistake. A lot of people don't want to be organized. They just want to be told when something's important once in a while, like just maybe once a year, right? To show up to something important. And the other thing is we don't mobilize people the opportunities to become organized, right? We don't offer people opportunities to grow leadership, grow skills, fail at things, and get better. And so those are the two, so maybe a little spectrum instead of like opposite things, but like like we need a little bit of both. But I think what Anna and I both are saying, and then I cut off Jonathan, so I apologize, is that we need this interplay of tactics, that we can't just simply rely on the few people to do the same thing over and over again and expect a better outcome.
The quick things that I just want to note, two things. One thing that I thought was just like a really good example of a campaign from last session. I thought that Families for Justice is Healing in their prison moratorium campaign, where they did go directly to Ron Mariano and Karen Spilka's districts and knock doors to talk to people about the prison moratorium campaign to see who that they could get to reach out about that, because then that is a way of, you're noting about getting people who aren't typically already engaged and talking to them. And even if you get only a few of them out of it, that still has a lot of value, because it's the legislators are hearing from people that they don't typically hear from, and it builds a sense of momentum. And one of the, I remember always finding impressive in that campaign where the power mapping exercise that was clearly done in there, when they realized that if they wanted to stop the building of a new women's prison, you have both the state actors who are the ones approving the funding and the contracts for this, but you also have the construction and architectural firms that are bidding for the prison itself that you need to target. And when they did like an active campaign to get the companies to pull out of the process by publicly shaming them for being involved in designing a prison, and how that's another kind of a tool to like being able to use those different leverage points, which I thought was really, really impressive. And the other quick line that I wanted to reference that I always end up thinking of is back in undergrad, when in the environmental group we had collected a number of signatures to increase how much the university did for renewable energy. And what we got out of that wasn't that, but like the Sustainability Advisory Committee that we got. That I always remember when the VP of facilities had said, "You don't have power, but you have influence." And the thing that sticks to me with that is that power, always about that, is how people often mistake influence for power, and they're not the same thing. And it is a useful thing to know that like it is good to leverage the influence that you have, but you can't mistake the influence for actual power, because they're not the same thing.
Oh, I love that. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that exact thing. Because I think this is something that a lot of organizations on the left take as an unquestioned assumption that influence to adjacency to power is what they're going for, is the goal, adjacency to power. And I'm going to start off by saying, like, there's this power analysis that people are trained to do, right? This is a very common power analysis. So what you do is you first list all of the people in power. Start there, right? Limit your list to people who are in power. And then you put them on a scale of, do they agree with us completely? Do they agree with us mostly? Are they like kind of in the middle? Are they, mostly against us? Are they totally against us? And which of them do you think has some ability to move closer to your position? And so what it basically says is it totally negates the idea that people who aren't on that list of people in power should ever be reached out to, that somehow you can't build power, that all you can do is get close to power. And so the idea is, you like, which of these people can we become friends with, or like get close to, or do favors to, with the hope that maybe with no carrot, they will somehow do what we want.
I guess I'll say, I think that's unfortunately, if you're doing a power analysis, right, it's not the only way to do it. So I don't want people to think you shouldn't do a power analysis, but if you're doing one that's correct, you're getting into more intricacies of what is your sticks and power and carrots. But yes, most of the time, the only thing they do is figure out who's gettable and then just try to go talk to that one person and end it there. Yeah. And I think, one of the mistakes that people make when they do this work is they think that just being friends with these people and sort of being friends with people who have power is the way to get them to do the things you want them to do. And as we've made clear here, that is a crapshoot at best. Like, it's not you're not gonna get nothing. It's that, you're waiting for the king to like spill some food so you get some scraps. Mm-hmm. Like, that's essentially the model you're talking about. And that might work occasionally, but the only people who will be affording to live in Massachusetts, if we continue with this path, the parts that won't be underwater, will be a few foreign banks, right? Like, who own all the property. Like, that's just not, it's just not a sustainable, that pace of change is too slow to the big problems we have in front of us.
And to those people listening to us, we know you want change. We know that's what you guys are volunteering. You guys are donating. Like, you don't want to do that with no change. You want for change to actually happen. We all do.
Yeah. And so I think, it's one of the things as opposed to, it's not that adjacency has no purpose. You need people who can talk to people in power. It's that it's a tactic. It's one tactic that has to be a part of a broader plan. And people begin and end their plans with that. And that's the problem. Right. And when we say begin and end, I don't mean that they do absolutely nothing else, but that's essentially the majority of it. Mm-hmm. It's maybe one press conference in front of the State House, one press release to the Boston Globe. We'll talk about your article one time, and maybe a local paper will pick it up if you're lucky and run that one time. And then you'll spend all of your time just talking to a few people who are close to that one person. And those are most of the campaigns that people engage in. And it's just like, how many times does it have to fail before people go, maybe we should do more or different or mix it up.
Yeah. And I'm going to throw in a little bit about this RPA story, right? So the people who took over the city of Richmond, right? And they managed to pass a bunch of great policies. Just one little example about how, when Jordan's talking about tactics, right? If your tactic is, if your only entire strategy is lobbying, or if your entire strategy is, this kind of thing where it's a single tactic, right? That isn't going to work. But here's how, for example, in Richmond, what they did by using tactics in a whole strategy, right, that had a stick involved, and carrots, and I'd love to talk about carrots soon. So they ran their first two candidates, right, in the election of 2003, 2004, and they, for 8 months, they worked with a whole coalition of folks to end an anti-camping ordinance that was essentially an anti-homeless people ordinance. It meant no one could sleep in any public places. And so they wanted to end this ordinance. They had a whole coalition, and for 8 months, they were doing candlelight vigils before all the city council meetings. They did what they called a bombardment of postcards to all the city councilors. They had marches. They wrote letters to the editor. They did all this stuff. And for 8 months, no change. All of the city councilors voted against it. And then, but at the same time, they were running candidates. And one of their candidates those two candidates were like, we are the only people running who want to get rid of this policy, the only ones. And when one of those people won, they made that they had a whole suite of policies, but they made that their signature policy. And when one of those people won, just one out of, I think, either 7 or 9 city councilors, 1 month after that person was inaugurated into office, the entire city council changed their tune and they voted to get rid of the policy, because they realized that the entire city had been mobilized around this policy. They heard everything, but they thought that there were no carrots and no sticks. And so they weren't going to change. But then they realized one of their people lost their job and they didn't want to lose their job. So they, enough of them that they got to a majority of people to change that policy. And this is what, when we're talking about like having a more, a larger, broader strategy that involves carrots and sticks, these are the kinds of things that, you can get into.
It's a great, I think that's just a great case of like showing that central to power is that action is the ability to create the consequences out of actions in things, right? If we were kind of the general line of how actions have consequences and that it would have been very easy for a number of those kind of sitting counselors to say that like, yeah, I'm hearing from a number of people about this, but I know in my heart of hearts that my constituents don't actually agree with these people.
Uh-huh.
And then the ability to then, by making the campaign about that and kicking them out, it's huge about shaping perception.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the important thing, and I want to talk about the sort of universe that we're going to mix metaphors. I'm going to talk about sort of the soup that we're going to swim in around this, that people are in, that when you do all of those visuals, all of those actions, all of those tactics, that creates an atmosphere that the media can't ignore, that the politicians can't ignore. And when you do those tactics in pairing with talking on the doors with regular people about those issues. So you take this issue that otherwise is going to be, I guarantee you that the local paper talked about it in a way that was against the poor people. I guarantee it. I guarantee you that the first quote in every single one of those articles was from a business owner or a policeman about how terrible homeless people are, how they should somehow disappear. I guarantee it.
Or homeowners, a lot of the homeowners didn't want it to change.
Yeah. I guarantee you that having those conversations person to person on the doors with regular people changed minds, changed ideas, and all of the ways in which, because we think of one thing as the fix, but that's not how it works. Right. You need to do all the things to get the change. You need to do the cacophony. You need to create a whole sort of feeling that this is the right and moral and good policy for the place. And that takes through all of those avenues, working together to get those done. And part of the thing that happens in our current structure is that part of the reason that there's no stick is that legislature just generally thinks you're not going to know about what it's up to. Most people don't blame their legislator for the fact that it's no longer affordable to live in our community. I'm seeing homes that should be $100,000 at most, right? Like that are $500,000 being sold in Worcester right now. That's untethered to reality, but that is a policy decision. These are policy decisions, and our legislators could and should be making policy to make it more affordable to live here. It took forever for me to travel recently by train. It does not have to. There are countries a quarter of the size of Massachusetts economy who get their people around in faster times than we do. It's a policy choice. It's the inaction of legislators, the inaction of us to believe that they could and should solve these problems. That is the reason that these they're not without solutions. They are not without ideas. There are ideas floating around that are 30 and 40 years old that they could pick up and introduce now, or that are in other places, right? So as we've seen in other podcasts that we've talked about, like there's not for want, but we have it's like one of the only good things George W. Bush said, right? Like the soft bigotry of low expectations. We have this belief that they just can't fix these big things. And that's not the case. And so the media doesn't cover them. It doesn't treat these issues as solvable by them. And if they ever do try to solve them, it always comes with this idea that has always privilege the more conservative voices in these conversations, right? In these things. So they can solve these things.
Yeah. And I'm going to jump in with a little about like the idea that democracy is our only stick, right? And like democracy should absolutely be a big stick that we have to offer, right? We should be able to vote these people out with a better solution. And, if democracy, there are other carrots and sticks. If democracy is the stick that we want to use, then we got to look back to the ancient Greeks, who were very clear that in order to have a true democracy, you have to have an informed public. That is a necessity. And, we not only have an apathetic public when it comes to state politics, because people literally, they don't think it matters. They think it's fine. They don't even know they literally don't even know what the state house does or what the state government is capable of doing. But the state government has ensured through their rules that we cannot know how people are voting. That makes us completely unable to vote for or against individual legislators based upon the policies that we want them to vote for, based upon the job that we want them to do. So it is literally reducing our ability to use democracy as a stick by the fact that we don't know. Like we just have no information, right? It's really hard to run against people they hardly have a voting record.
And there's hardly any coverage of what they're doing and not doing. There's hardly any ties. No one's writing about the day-to-day lives that people have and the policy solutions that could be being passed. People write about the tea as if the tea exploding is just in a vacuum. There's never a connection to the broader tax cuts that we did in the 1990s, the way in which we burdened that Charlie Baker burdened the MBTA with debt from the big dig that has nothing to do with the MBTA. There's never any context. The media never creates context, and it never ties these problems to policies that could solve these things, right? No one's requiring you to take a Democratic or Republican position on these policies, but it is, in fact, a truth. It is a fact to say that there are policy solutions out there that people could explore from their ideological belief systems to solve all of these problems, but there's never a connection. It's just like, oh, this thing happened.
I think that's such an important point, because in the way in which, like, how basically transferring kind of ideology into power is about being able to be the one who decides which dots are connected. Because that's how it's often when talking about people about what ideology it is. I know it's the fact that the world is a series of dots, and that which dots that you choose to connect is ideology. It's what things that when writing a story you are asserting are relevant to the thing that you're covering. And there's a clear element of power in there about the ability to say that this is connected to that, this social problem is connected to this policy. It is a core kind of demonstration of power, as opposed to the flip side of being able to assert that no, in fact, that they're not. As often that we deal with those who would like to pretend that certain things aren't connected. But thinking of making connections, Anna, you wanted to chime in.
Oh, I always love to chime in the middle. And first of all, thank people who have donated to the show. We had another wonderful person who donated some more than a cup of coffee to the show, that's for sure. So that was amazing. And please let us know if we can ever thank you, if you're a donor to the show, if we can thank you on the show. But listeners, you can donate, you can give us $5, you can give us $10, you can give us whatever, this podcast and this information is worth to you. As you can tell, we're talking about how important it is, if we're going to have a democracy, for people to be informed. And that is what we're doing here. As Jordan mentioned last week, these donations are not going to pay any of us. None of us get paid for this. They are going to an artist, a video editor. They're going to people who are really helping us to get this podcast, make it really professional, and get it into the hands of as many people as possible. If we would also love it if you would forward this to your friends, to your coworkers, to your comrades in this, this fight that we are in, that we all have joined to make our state a better place to live, to protect people who are vulnerable. If you believe in fighting for social justice, for climate action, in reducing inequality, and healthcare for all, if you believe in affordable housing and reforming our criminal justice system, and any of these policies that we all, really have been fighting for many years, you should be listening to this podcast. Your friends should be listening to this podcast. So we want to make sure that you and your friends are always being able to understand what's really happening, what's actually going on in state politics, why it is so broken, what we could have here in Massachusetts if we fixed it, and how you can get involved. And to get back to our discussion, did you want to chime in on that? To get back to our discussion on power, I want to have a little discussion of sort of which side are you on? And I'm calling it that because I think there are many very well-meaning groups on the left that are doing what they believe is the best thing to do, but that in my mind, and I suspect also for Jordan and Jonathan, in all of our minds, is actually not helping us build power, is actually removing our power, is diminishing our power. And so, one of the things that I want to talk about is the way that adjacency to power gives more power to the powerful and less power to those who don't have power. I'll just frame it a little bit in a way that we framed it in a previous podcast, which is that we don't have a republic. We're not a purple state. So we don't have these two power centers, each of which has carrots and sticks, that are vying for the attention of the populace. And, and when they get a majority, they pass their policies. What we have is a one-party state where there is only one center of power that has all of the carrots and all of the sticks. And the only way for progressives to get our policies passed, if we are realistic, if we remember that we actually passed public financing of elections, but what happened was the state house refused to fund it until a few years went by, and they were able to just vote it down again. That might be a little bit oversimplifying that, but we actually we were on a path to have Medicare for all until the speaker and people at the state house literally broke the law to not allow it to go up for a vote the second time around that it was required to go up for a vote. And so when we observe how the other side exercises power, what I want to mention is that by, those two instances, people in those positions of being state reps, they could have spoken up. They could have not just silently allowed these things to happen. And what we do, meaning like the broader progressive left, is we want adjacency to power. And by asking for that adjacency to power, we fear ever standing up and saying, that is not okay with me. We think that we have to always agree. And this is the position that our state reps are in. They feel they have to always agree, or else they will never get that position where maybe they'll have power in the future. The ability to understand that we cannot just, do what that side wants us to do. We have to have the willingness to speak up and say when we have had enough.
I'll just say that I guess I'll say that the problem that a lot of state reps fall into is that the ecosystem that they would do that into isn't prepared to even support them should they want to do that. They would immediately get pushback from groups that have access to power. They would not get covered in the Boston Globe or the State House News, who also view this problem. They also view their job as access to power. The Boston Globe is not writing every day about transparency, about these things, maybe once, but they're not largely, the Boston Globe isn't talking about the rampant sexual misconduct in the state house. It's not talking about the way the bills that aren't getting passed or connecting people to these things. Right? It's not writing about these things. It wants access to the powerful. So it also has an interest in it. When there are legislators who have spoken out, what happens is that there is a loud silence mostly, and a few people quietly telling them, see, this is why you shouldn't, who should be their allies, who should be echoing them, who should be promoting them speaking out, who should be saying, look how this is what we need people to be honest, to tell people what's actually happening. Instead, they get whispered to, don't do that. by people who should be things. And so, and then the WBR doesn't cover it.
Yeah.
The local, Jim Brody show's not covering it. More Monday local news isn't covering it. The 5 o'clock news isn't covering it. Boston Globe isn't covering it.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it just becomes like, why even bother?
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what I'm getting at with this. Which side are you on? I'm not necessarily talking about the state reps who aren't speaking up. I'm saying that what you're saying is the state reps who do speak up occasionally, they are betrayed by these well-meaning on the left organizations who believe that by not offending the groups in power, by maintaining their adjacency to power, by doing this silence or whispering and saying, oh, don't do that. Like that is in fact the which side are you on question that I have, which is really for the progressive organizers and the progressive, the progressive organizations on the left.
What you were saying just made me think of one kind of conceptual way that I think is useful to talk about that, like of immediate steps and how they help or possibly harm the longer term like shaping of what becomes possible, is about how like many people who think that they're digging a path are digging a hole. And to kind of view it that way is that if you're kind of trying to like dig that path forward, like if you end up deeper and deeper and deeper and then you're no longer actually on ground anymore, you can't do the thing. And about how to be kind of then be intentional in making sure you aren't actually thus like weakening yourself in the process of taking steps forward.
Yeah. And so I think the thing is, it's not that there shouldn't be, again, a diversity of tactics or diversity of groups or diversity of relationships. It's that we need to be clear about who's doing what and seeing us all on the same side and the same part of it. One of the things I always take away from the stories of my grandfather's civil rights movement is that the NAACP was the right flank of the civil rights movement. And sure, they complained. They were like these radicals, these things, but ultimately they understood that it took that they could come into the rooms and be like, look, you want to do these people, listen, like you're either going to get people in the streets or you're going to mollify them by passing some things, right? Like otherwise they're going to be out there again. Right. And we can't stop them. And so like that has to be the way, rather than taking their energy and just spending all of their energy dumping on the people who are trying to push loudly, obnoxiously, unfairly, right? Rather than tone policing, tactic policing, the people who are loudly making noise, they need to be focusing that energy back inward and quietly actually supporting the people who are loudly being like, they need to see them as a part of that thing. We don't need every group to do the same thing. We don't need every group to be the loud, obnoxious people, but we need the groups that see themselves as the arbiters of access to that, to see the loud, obnoxious people as a part of the plan and plan accordingly and understand that that's a part of it. And we need more people willing to do that work. We need people willing to unapologetically door knock in these people's districts, in these powerful people's places, to rile people up, to push people forward, right? We need all of those tactics together to make this sort of change. And we need to be communicating that publicly to people where they are, on local news, on social media, where people get their information. We need to be talking to people in those spaces because they as a part of the democracy part to the stick, right? And so I think like we need all of those things together, and we just it's just too haphazard at the moment.
Yeah. Jonathan, any last words about power?
Last words is kind of building off of Jordan's comments. One example I often think back to is my experience organizing against the Olympic bid. And the one thing that I thought was very helpful is the fact that when some friends and I had gotten together and that we had decided that it was best to have an organization that was going to be separate from No Boston Olympics, the main group, kind of Chris Dempsey, who had run for Otter, being one of the most prominent faces of, where since they were going to be people who had access to kind of realms of power, whereas I had described us as not having the bridges to burn, and knowing that allowed for a different set of tactics. and that it was useful to have a certain degree of separation between them, and along with like friendly communication and general belief, like general kind of general alliance, but to allow for that diversity of tactics and arguments and degrees of kind of oppositional rhetoric and intensity, knowing that you needed to operate on both fronts at the same time to be successful. And I always think that that's something that can too often be forgotten by those who are doing the kind of access to power route, by that the other people are helping you, that like are helping you accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, and your ability to make progress within that kind of realm of power is actually enhanced by those who make noise outside.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, everybody who's listening here today. We love having these conversations with you, and please let us know what topics you want us to cover. We look forward to chatting with y'all next week. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.